Good morning. When I was digging through the closet looking for NANOG t-shirts, the most recent and sort of least ripped up one I could find was this one, which is from 2010. So thank you for inviting me back. It has been that long since I was here. So I am indeed going to talk about DNS wars. Sorry I won't be here Wednesday to hear the talk that will be given then. But there's an awful lot to know, so I expect they're going to cover a lot of the technical details on Wednesday. And what I'm here to tell you about is the socioeconomic and possibly anthropologic aspects of the problem. So there has been a war for control of the DNS resolution path. It's going into its third decade now. And the reason for that is obvious to anybody who works in DNS, because we get so many queries to our servers, which are the enabler, it's the enabling event of some TCP/IP session. So pretty much before anything else, good or bad, happens on the internet, a DNS query is made. And there are a lot of them, and answering them is important. Turns out also that being able to observe them is important, and there are both good non-controversial and bad controversial ways to do that observation. I'm going to cover that. I want to tell you a little bit about the history so that you can contextualize what is happening today with the web community, the W3C and the IETF working groups that work on the web. And their apparent interest in DNS and how that is manifesting, because it will change some of what you can do today in ways that you may or may not care about. But first, let me begin with what's also happening. I don't want to cover this in detail, but I want to say that the idea of making a DNS query seems archaic to some. And so there is a series of technologies called collectively resolverless DNS. The idea here is that if you receive a web object, let's say it's an index.html file, and it's going to have some references for images, JavaScript files, style files, that kind of thing. The browser is doing the best it can. It is parsing that index file as it comes over the TCP connection. And every time it discovers a reference, it starts a DNS query for that, and if possible, will also fetch that object in parallel. So it maximizes parallelism. However, there is still some extra time for that question to be sent somewhere and for an answer to be then found and returned. The money that makes all of our cool web stuff possible is not coming from the G Suite. It is not coming from newspapers per se. It's not coming from us. It's coming from the advertising industry. And they care a lot about being able to target their ads, and also they care quite a bit about delivering those ads as quickly as possible. There's a metric that I call time to next eyeball, which is the number of nanoseconds between when you stop clicking the mouse and when the first photon of the next ad hits your eyeball. They are always looking for ways to reduce this. So, after I tell you the rest of the story, I hope that you will remember that this is also coming, and therefore we are not at the bottom yet. They are going to be including DNS bindings. In other words, this name has that address in the meta headers of web objects, so that the browser will not have to make a separate query. There will be no DNSSEC involved, so the browser's ability to reject bad information, let's say from a website defacement event, will be non-existent. But if you were in the advertising business and you cared about the time to next eyeball, this is the kind of thing that you would come up with. We could even struggle a little bit and see that the web was born inside the internet and now wants to leave home. Anyway, so do read up on this. They need some counsel at best. So, history. In a little town in what is now Germany called Westphalia, some people met in 1648 in order to execute some treaties. They wanted to end the 30 Years' War and also the 70 Years' War. And the war was, I guess, beneficial in some economic sense for a while, but it had begun costing them too much, and so everybody pretty much wanted to stop fighting. But they had a problem, which was there were too many parties who wanted to be at the table to conduct the negotiations. And they had to find a way to exclude those who were not strictly necessary. And that is where our modern definition of a nation came from. It was those people trying to figure out who would be allowed to sit at the table and negotiate this peace. And what they came up with, not unreasonable, is that we will treat you as a nation if you have a defined border, if you demonstrate the ability to govern within that border, especially to keep people from inside that border from attacking their neighbors, because that would be seen as an act of war, and if you can defend the border against outsiders. So basically, this codified the rule of the strongest. If you are strong enough to do these things, we will treat you as a nation, and you may sit here at this table and negotiate with us. Now, the United States of America did not exist at that time. Nevertheless, this is the same definition of nationhood, give or take a couple of words, that we use today. It is what the United Nations uses. And what's interesting about this definition is at that time, the domain of operations, either for people, for companies, such as they then were, wealthy families, and nations, were just land and sea. They knew all about getting superiority, the ability to control a piece of land or a piece of sea. And everything that they thought about treaties and everything they thought about the definition of nations and the ability, let's say, to defend your borders was written in terms of the first two domains of operation that were at that time known. So we cannot fault them for not seeing forward in time and saying, wait, when there's a guy in a biplane with a machine gun, these borders are going to get kind of fuzzy. We can also forgive them for not understanding things like bird flu, which also do not respect borders. But I think if you stare down this list of air, sea, space, and I guess quantum is going to be number 6, you'll quickly get the idea that the definition of a nation is not as useful now as it was in 1648. There are many people who think that we are now in the post-national era, that code is law, and that we are going to have direct control of our destinies without governments, without nations. I don't agree with that. I'm not going to get into the reasons why, but I do want to say there is a lot of pressure to figure out what a nation is in a world that has IT in it, which is completely borderless, unless you count the Great Firewall of China. But the hierarchy of values within the domains that you are then aware of is ideally you'd like to have supremacy, and if you can't get that, you'd like to have parity, detent, and worst case, you'd like to at least be aware of that domain rather than being surprised that all of a sudden you are being attacked or kicked around in some way using a domain of operations that you learned that day existed. So, yeah. So talking about DNS, this is the traditional architecture. I'm going to walk you through it. Most of you know this stuff, but to the dozen or so who wandered in here wondering what we were meeting about today, I will say that DNS only has 3 types of protocol speakers. There are hundreds of millions of them collectively, and they send hundreds of billions of packets to each other every day, but all of it boils down to one of these 3 types. So your laptop is probably an example of a stub resolver at the bottom. My laptop is an example of the recursive server, but that's probably not your game. So a stub resolver gets a DNS server IP as part of getting its IP address. So as part of a DHCP transaction, it will be told, and in addition to telling you what your gateway is, your address, maybe the netmask, I'm also going to give you some DNS servers. We don't have to use those, and indeed a lot of people don't. They override this to use 8.8, 1.1, 9.9, or something, or they might send it to their corporate VPN. There are good reasons to do that. Nevertheless, the stub resolver is starting out almost tabula rasa. It knows where to send its queries, and that's all it knows. The server it is sending to is the most complicated of the three. That thing has the job of answering from its cache if you ask it for something that it has already recently enough discovered, or going upstream to the authority servers to get the information you need if it's not already in cache. So that middle box, the recursive server, is where all the complexity, all the bugs, all the cert advisories, all the DDoSes, everything that can go wrong in DNS goes wrong in that middle box. The top, the authority servers, is where data enters the system from the outside, right? DNS is not all-knowing. You have to tell it things so that it can carry that information around for you. And you'll note that there is traditionally, at least in enterprises, an IP firewall, so that the recursive server is the only device, or whatever set of recursive servers you have, are the only ones allowed to talk to authority servers. And that keeps shadow IT from occurring, and also gives you kind of a control point for cybersecurity. And I'm going to come to some examples of that in a moment. In any case, that's how it was built, and it has scaled 9 orders of magnitude without changing this basic picture. And I think that means that if you meet Paul Macapetris somewhere, you owe him a glass of red wine. This is the topology that we had in the middle of commercialization and privatization. Now, I came to a meeting that later got renamed NANOG. At least Garrick was running the regional techs meeting and invited me to come talk about DNS before the name NANOG was coined. So at that time, we didn't have a fully developed commercial internet, but by 1999, we pretty much did, and it pretty much looked like this. And for the purpose of our DNS story, what I want you to realize is that there was a time that servers were so expensive, computers were so expensive, that you might only have one. And so your apps and your login shells and your recursive name server were probably all running on one box, and that box might have some kind of a 56K link to CSNet or something like that. Eventually we got Ethernet, and we started getting Sun workstations and other cheap devices, and it became possible to have a whole collection of cooperating internet hosts inside of some campus. And we moved the server off to the LAN. We just said, I'm not going to put a server on every workstation. That would be hard to manage, so we'll just put one on the LAN somewhere. Then we got campuses and moved the servers to the campus, because again, it doesn't take very much computational horsepower to run one of these. There's no reason to put one on every LAN if you've got 50 LANs in a campus in Santa Clara somewhere. When we got ISPs, instead of having to make our own internet by finding a bunch of people to peer with, the ISP said, hey, you can just send your recursive DNS traffic to us, and we will handle that for all of our customers. And that was not a bad idea, because those people were usually on top of things. They knew that, okay, there's a bug in bind or whatever, I got to fix that today, whereas not every one of their commercial customers had that level of awareness. But although I don't have any animation to show it, I want you to imagine that the recursive name server started in the bottom box and successively moved 1 box away, 2 boxes, 3 boxes. It keeps getting further away from where the questions are coming. This will continue. So that was the situation going into the new millennium, and various people came into this and said, hey, there's got to be a way to monetize. I need to disintermediate. I need to disrupt the old economy. I need to make a lot of money and buy flashy cars and get out. So the first major attack, there were a number of minor attacks, but the first major attack on the DNS resolution path came from VeriSign. They were running .com, and they were looking at their server logs, and they said, gee, a lot of people ask us questions for which our answer is negative, right? They've had a typographical error, they've typed something that doesn't exist yet, they've typed something that has recently expired, whatever it is. what can we do with that data? And so they did what now seems quite common, but was controversial for the moment, which was to keep all of your negative answers and use them as keywords to figure out what ads they might be able to sell. They partnered with a company called SiteFinder, and then one day they added a wild card to the top of the .com zone so that they were no longer able to produce negative answers. You would either get a real answer that was what you were looking for, or you would get a synthetic answer that was a pointer to the SiteFinder search engine. So a lot of people got pretty upset about this. I somewhere have a t-shirt that was made for us by Olaf Kolkman. He and I were both on the ICANN Security and Stability Advisory Committee at the time, and since all of us had been named as co-conspirators in VeriSign's lawsuit against ICANN, he made a t-shirt, so I am actually an accredited VeriCrime co-conspirator. And I should have worn that shirt today, I suppose. But that ended, as things do. First, my company, Internet Systems Consortium, where I then worked, put out a patch to bind that undid the effect of this, and it was a really, really ugly thing. But it worked, and it made a lot of people angry, and probably would have earned me my own lawsuit if they weren't already suing ICANN. But eventually, everybody went away happy, and it was all good. Next up, OpenDNS came along and said, you know, I see how you have moved the recursive server further and further from where the questions come from, and that's all good, but we think we could move it even further away. So we're going to put an Anycast recursive DNS service in however many metros they could then afford to do, so that you would go through your ISP, through that internet cloudy thing that's in the middle of most of our diagrams, out the other side to reach a recursive service. And they tried the same thing SiteFinder had done, but they didn't make any money at it, so they gave up. So the whole idea about sending people to an advertising server based on the DNS question they asked has never really made a lot of money for anybody, but they all think of it. But they failed fast, and they tried the next thing, which was to answer differently for www.google.com. They gave the address of their own search page. This was seen, as you might expect, as controversial by Google. So I'm sure phone calls were made and questions were asked and demands were issued. And ultimately, OpenDNS said, look, we don't have a search engine, we just have a search page. And we're collecting the keywords so that we can figure out what that stub resolver cares about so that we can help our advertising customers target their ads. And then after they hit the I'm feeling lucky button on our page, we're just redirecting them to you, Google. So you still get all the money and all the data that you were going to get. You see everything that you were seeing before, and you get a chance to answer with your own ads and all the rest of that stuff. So, you know, please just calm down. This is not a big deal. And, you know, I did not work at Google at the time, and I can't say that there was cause and effect here, but I will say that within 45 days, Google created 8.8. Which is what I would have done in response to that kind of thing, which is, well, if you're going to try to take traffic away from us, then I guess we're going to have to take the traffic back. So they were, in other words, to reestablish the status quo. Finally, when so many recursive services were anycasted, it was no longer possible for a web server to look at the IP address of a DNS query that was coming to, you know, the authority server for example.com, and use that IP address as a good predictor of where a subsequent web fetch, in other words, a TCP connection on port 80, would then come from. And since they were using the location of your DNS server as a proxy for your likely location, in other words, which of the many mirrors of a CDN should you be told to fetch, this kind of broke things. And as a result, we have added, quite against my will I might add, something called eDNS client subnet, by which the cache miss traffic, let's see if I can make us go backward here. The cache miss traffic above the recursive ends up containing the network portion of the address of the stub resolver. It's not supposed to be the full address because that would be an information leak, right? It tends to be the full address. Most of the IoT devices didn't read that part of the ECS RFC. They're including the entire address. Nevertheless, it's an information leak, even if all it has is your network, according to me. And that eDNS client subnet is such a disaster for privacy that not even Cloudflare will support it. So people using 1.1 are not getting the CDN effects other than when they're talking to web properties that Cloudflare themselves publishes. But these are 3 different times that folks have said the DNS resolution path doesn't have enough of me in it, so where can I interpose? So now we're doing this again, but I wanted you to have that context. So now, as I said, we're going further than we used to go. The recursive name server has now moved to the pretty much last point. Unless we put it on another planet, it cannot get further from the place where the questions enter. But because it is sort of not topologically nearby where the campus or the LAN is, we've got this eDNS client subnet, so some of the DNS information is also being transmitted to the CDN. And for a while, it looked like everybody was getting everything they wanted and that we would stop. But no, actually, it turned out there were a lot of people worried about this. Because when you move something further away and you add more intermediate parties, you give a lot more people a chance to monitor what's going on. DNS does have some security, but that's only on authentication of the data. In other words, you can receive something that is false and know it's false, but it won't have been a secret from anybody between you and the far end. And so this was one of the things that Edward Snowden disclosed about when he flew to Hong Kong in 2013. And the IETF got very excited about this and decided that they were going to encrypt everything. And we encrypted, DNS was so important, we encrypted it twice. So the first thing that happened was DNS over TLS. So it's a very straightforward TCP-based protocol. You connect, you exchange keys, and then you exchange your questions and answers. But they also improved quite a bit of the old DNS TCP protocol, which was hokey. So this is a solid protocol, and in my opinion, if you combine DNS over TLS with what's called TCP fast open, we could stop using UDP. We've got a way to manage the state load down. We've got a good enough transport protocol that we could actually take DNS out of UDP. However, that did not solve an important problem that the web portion of the IETF saw, which was, although it was unreadable, it was still quite apparent that a DNS query was happening because it had a dedicated port number, 853. And that also meant that those of us with firewalls were capable of blocking that. And I think I showed you on the architecture page that I do block the outbound DNS unless it's coming from my servers, because to me, DNS is a very good control point for cybersecurity. But these folks did not like that, and so they came up with their own protocol, which was published a year or so after DOT. It's called DOH, and all hell has broken loose. Here's the modified architecture. The stuff you see on the right with the RPZ, that's response policy zones, that's a way to insert policy into your recursive server. You might not want it to answer for the command and control names of today's DGA botnet, for example. And DNS TAP is an open protocol also developed by my team, by which you can sort of write one observation tool for your DNS, and it won't be based on PCAP or BPF. The name server will actually export its telemetry to whatever you configure it to export to. So that was our addition. And over on the left, you'll see the DOH people who have now got apps doing DNS, in particular web browsers. They are speaking to recursive servers, and they're doing it over TCP port 443, and thus bypassing the firewall. And they consider this a good design because that firewall might be an authoritarian regime, and there may be dissidents, and don't we all want more freedom? In any case, this is going to be a problem for those of us who still want to have firewalls. If it's a problem for an authoritative regime somewhere, they're probably not going to ask my opinion, so I'm not going to give it to them. But it's a problem for me, and so I'm going to tell you what's going on there. Now, I want to say first and foremost, this is not a technology project. They did not have a technological statement of work. Their problem statement had nothing to do with performance. It was all about eavesdropping and being able to block. And in the history that I have lived, we have not successfully solved a political problem using technology means. All we do is a tick, and then our opposition has the talk, and we just kind of keep going back and forth, and everybody takes their turn, making things more complicated and worse. Also, this doesn't give you very much in the way of privacy, because if you're not in Tor or some other VPN, then the next thing you're going to do after you get a DNS answer is make a TCP SYN packet and send that out. And that might be to a CDN that's got 2 million hosts, in which case it's a little hard to guess which of those virtual hosts you're talking to. But that is not the norm. That's not even half the traffic I see. So most of the time you can guess what answer they got based on what they do next. And if you have a passive DNS database, which I do, it's very easy to go from the answer you think they got to the question they must have asked. So in other words, if you want to keep a dissident out of jail, teach them how to use Tor. Don't tell them that DOH is going to keep them out of jail, because they may or may not be phoning you from jail, if they're allowed to do so, complaining about the bad advice you gave them. And if you're going to use a VPN, you certainly don't need DOH. You're just going to put all your DNS traffic in the VPN. So this is not just a political project, it is a solution to a problem we're not having. But it will create problems that we didn't have before, so maybe that is also part of the point. At 18 minutes, I'm going to skip some of these details, but these slides will be available to you later. The biggest single issue for me is that I am not an authoritarian country. I am an authoritarian. That's why I have a firewall. There are things that my employees or my children or my servers are not allowed to do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm sure that my children used to complain about that, but in general, this is how we do it. And I've had a lot of people come to me and say that that's archaic, you shouldn't do that, firewalls are 1990s technology, you should secure your endpoints. That's hard. I'll explain in a moment. But let me also just say that there is a theory under which the Chinese Communist Party has a budget, that there is a maximum amount of electric power, human effort, human time, and money that they are willing to spend making sure that they have thought control across their population. And so there's a theory that if we make this too complicated for them, then it will be like the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We will outspend them, and then they will eventually, their economy will collapse and so forth. Let me tell you that I've been to China a fair bit. I have friends, I have businesses, I have partners, and there is no such limit. They have all the money, and they will spend the last electron on Earth maintaining their regime. So making it more complicated for them is just the next step in a long game. This won't be decisive, in other words. So let me tell you about securing the endpoint. There's a wonderful article out there on Medium. You can find it by Googling for "everything is broken Medium." The NSA is doing so well because software is bullshit. These are just quotes that I pulled out to incent you to go Google for this. The next time you think your grandma is uncool, give her credit for her time helping dangerous Russian criminals extort money from offshore casinos with DDoS attacks. C is good for two things: being beautiful and creating catastrophic 0 days in memory management. And most importantly, when we tell you to apply updates, we're not telling you to mend your ship. We're telling you to keep bailing before the water gets to your neck. So the reason that I'm using DNS as a control point for cybersecurity is because I can't secure my endpoints. My smart TV has got no defense at all, and mine has not been caught running a Bitcoin miner in JavaScript, but others have. And so the way that I figure out which of my endpoints needs some attention today so that I can secure my endpoints, as I'm being advised to do, is by looking at the DNS data. What questions is it asking? And is it asking a question that's completely uncharacteristic? And if it is, that's the reason that I go visit it. And I'm not alone. This business of kind of doing the best you can and only acting in the presence of an anomaly is how most of my enterprise customers are securing their enterprise networks, which might be multinational. So I got into a bit of a snit with Google because their Chromecast was ignoring my DHCP assignment of a name server. They were sending their DNS queries to 8.8, and I was really deeply unhappy about that, and I ended up talking to people from there. I think there's general knowledge that Vint knows me, and so I'm sure somebody came to him and said, could you call Vixie and calm him down? And so I had a meeting with various people, and they couldn't understand why I was objecting, right? It was their device. Just because I paid for it didn't mean that I owned it. And the question I wish I had asked is, so would you install an IoT device in a Google building on a Google network that was going to send all of its DNS traffic to, I don't know, 9.9 or 1.1? Because I don't think they would. I think they would say, I don't trust those people. And yet if I say, well, I don't trust you, that's something they can't hear. Anyway, that's the general attitude, is that we're just the caretakers of these devices. Good, covered all of it. The internet, according to some cocktail napkin from 1969, is a network of networks. The web is not. It is a network of eyeballs. It is people consuming ads that put all of the money into the web system. So when Google pays Mozilla $100 million a year for placement of the Google search engine on the front page, the default page of the Mozilla Firefox browser, all of that money came from the advertising industry. And when Mozilla begins to break out of this and try to diversify its income so that they don't have a single big donor, they're going to be taking money from other parts of the advertising industry. That doesn't mean they're evil. Advertisement is not a unalloyed bad, but we do have to be honest and say that the web's goals are not the same as the internet's goals. So I don't love the rule of the strongest, never have, and I'm seeing it appear here. There's a whole other effort. If you've been becoming a man in the middle for outbound HTTPS, you've got a Palo Alto Networks next-gen firewall, and it's catching the outbound SYN, setting up three-way handshake, letting the certificate be, or the request be sent, and then transmitting back a made-up certificate that happens to have been signed by something in the CA root of the client. That's about to stop working. That kind of thing really annoys the folks who heard everything Snowden had to say. And so in TLS version 1.3, they're going to encrypt the SNI. You won't know what certificate to transmit. You're going to be moving to an explicit proxy for all of that. Or you're going to give up and just let outbound HTTPS do what it does, which for compliance reasons, most of you can't do. The people who are designing all of this have nothing against you. They have got something against somebody who is indistinguishable from you, which is some ISP data mining the DNS in order to then attach keywords to their customers so that they can sell advertising targeting. And that's where, elephants are dancing and we just happen to be in the way. But I will say that I'm a little bit shocked at how far we've gone. Mozilla is going to change the default on Firefox in the US. If you check your Firefox, you may discover that it's already happened. they are not going to ask your permission. They're going to tell you that it is happening and give you a chance to opt out. And that data, instead of going to whatever system resolver that operating system is configured with, is going to be going to a trusted recursive resolver chosen for you by Mozilla. Currently, the only TRR that I know of is Cloudflare, but I feel sure that 9.9 and even 8.8 are going to apply for that status. It wouldn't matter if it wasn't Cloudflare. And my friend Bert Hubert has a rant that he does where he talks about national security letters and the fact that if you send your data to the United States, you have no idea who might be able to see it after it's been decrypted because the government has force majeure. He's not wrong, but I think that's irrelevant. In other words, if we were sending the data to a Dutch company, if we were sending the data to Bert Hubert, I would still say changing my configuration so that it exfiltrates something that I used to control the path of is not okay. To get us back to the Westphalia example, I want to say that there have been a few times in history that a corporation has signed a treaty with a nation. For example, you think about the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company signing treaties with various local regimes that they discovered as they traveled the world. But those were crown corporations. It was fairly clear to everybody that they represented a government somewhere. So when I heard that the UK government had objected to Mozilla's plan and had invited the Mozilla exec team to come to London and talk about it, and when there was a press release saying, okay, so Mozilla has agreed not to automatically change the DNS settings of anybody that they know that for sure is in the United Kingdom. This was not good news because they are only the first application doing DNS who had a policy that was controversial. If we know anything about the internet, is if there's one, there will shortly be 6 million. I also want to say that in the root zone of DNS, we have 250 or so country codes. They aren't all countries. But I don't imagine Mozilla visiting all of them to find out how that country feels about each thing. Nor do I imagine anybody who follows in Mozilla's footsteps is going to be wandering around signing treaties with governments around the world. And if I did imagine that, then I would want to know what is the new definition of nationhood. Is it your ability to impose your will, regardless of borders? In that case, we may have to start thinking about Mozilla differently. But I am deeply disappointed in them for taking this unilateral action. They are a non-profit public charity. They are supposed to act for the public good. Opt-out is never in the public good. So there was a time when the only way you could communicate on the internet from end to end was to fit through all of those holes. You had to speak a protocol that everybody along the path and at the far end would understand, or you wouldn't be heard. You had to use only the IP addresses, domain names, ASNs that had been allocated to you and not others, could just pick them at random, or you would also not be able to communicate. So that up until now, every communication on the internet relied on cooperation, and that cooperation could be withheld. You can imagine any of these operators moving their particular line segment up or down in order to cause misalignment. And that is the old way. What we're doing now is we have an internet standard, RFC 8484, that on page 1 says that this protocol is designed to prevent on-path interference in DNS operations. In other words, they were not shy, they were not coy, they did not keep their agenda a secret. They are saying that they like those yellow lines, and that anybody who wants to misalign is probably a bad actor. Here's an internet standard protocol stamped by the IAB and the IESG and other people who should have been grown-ups in the room that says those people in the middle are just dumb pipes, and it doesn't matter what they want or what they don't want. I bring this to you because NANOG, Network Operators Group, comes from the idea that the internet is a network of networks. And a few of you are from LTE providers, and all of you probably know that most internet growth is now mobile. So it's tiny devices without keyboards that are mobile. They will be on Wi-Fi sometimes, but they will be on LTE or 4G or whatever most of the time. So that's where smart companies are investing. They're not investing in people like you who have laptops because they don't think that you're going to buy very much. What they want is people who have smartphones, because there are a lot more of them and they tend to be younger. And so when I said elephants were dancing, I want to identify them. You've got the advertising industry, and then you've got the mobile telephony industry. Those are the elephants. They are after the advertising dollar. They want to track. One of them wants the other to be a dumb pipe. And if they could leave us out of it, if they could let my managed private network not be affected, they would have done it. They've got nothing against me. They've got nothing against any of your enterprise networks. You're not, statistically speaking, going to buy anything, so they just don't care. But they can't tell the difference between you and an ISP who wants to data mine your DNS traffic, or a repressive regime who wants to have thought control over their population. So we really are caught in the crossfire here. So it's a pretty standard hardball negotiating tactic to manage somebody's choices so that whatever they do they're going to hate, but one thing they will hate maybe less than they hate the other, and then you win that round of whatever game you're playing. So you do have choices. You can give up on this and just say, all right, I'm a dumb pipe. I'll try and secure my endpoints, and I'll deal with the collateral damage when I can't. Or you can do what I'm doing, which is to remember a time when network operators were expected to take responsibility for whatever came out of their network. Some of you know I started the first anti-spam company back in the mid-1990s. It was called MAPS, the Mail Abuse Prevention System. We created something called the RBL, which has since been renamed by Wikipedia. They call it the real-time block list. It is actually the real-time black hole list, and it was the first distributed reputation system. And when we were getting ready to put some ISP on that list such that they would not be able to send mail to our subscribers, they would inevitably say, that's coming from my customer, I have no power to stop them. And I would inevitably say, if you had a factory on the river and I lived downriver from you and you were dumping pollution in my river, I would expect you to stop, and I would not care what that took inside your factory to make it stop. And that's the situation we're in. But I don't know what I'm going to tell somebody if they say, look, it's all DOH. I can't block that. The IETF intends that I not be able to block that. So you can no longer hold me as a network operator responsible for the output of my network. That's going to be a dark day, and it is coming. So I believe the other thing that's going to come is a much better home firewall. And the folks in Prague at CZNIC Labs have created the Turris router, which is an example of something that has enough transistors inside of it and a strong enough power supply that you could expect it to do real things. It's not just a cheap, $10 plastic Linksys. It's a real device, and it costs real money. But I am expecting that a lot of homes are going to say everything has to go through an explicit proxy. And yes, that means we're strip searching the data on its way out of the house. That's what we have to do to protect ourselves, because we can't trust our apps anymore, even if they come from nonprofits. And I certainly know that the enterprise is going to have to move that way. So what we're going to end up doing is drastically increasing the complexity of the distributed system. And that ends poorly, because most increases in Q do not have a corresponding increase in the numerator. We are not adding understanding nearly as fast as we are adding complexity, which means that the percentage of what we have that we actually know anything about is going down. And now, instead of going down in some linear function where it's just worse year over year, we're about to have a step function in the complexity of this distributed system. So there's an oft repeated quote that turns out to be wrong. We often hear somebody say that every man's home is his castle and in it he is king. So this is the actual quote, and that was certainly a big part of kind of the general sentiment of governments and kings and voters and citizens and whatnot in the 18th century. But I have to say that if the king wants to use DOH, he'll have no choice about that, which means that we are going in the opposite direction from where we all thought the internet was going to take us. So finally, there is a butterfly effect. Whatever you do is going to change the future in some way. Whatever you abstain from doing, your actions have consequences, and many of those consequences will be tiny, and you will never know what they were. And even if you were looking for them, you wouldn't be able to determine what they were. And so I'm not asking everybody who ever builds anything to think about all of the downstream butterfly effects that could come from their actions or inactions or choices. But what I would like to do is to get more people to think about that complexity equation and realize that they have to live and their families have to grow up in a world that they are helping to make. And I would like people to realize that game theory applies. And even if you don't want to study the math of game theory, you should at least be thinking in terms of, okay, I'm going to make a move. We've got a game board, I've got pieces, other people have got pieces, I'm going to make a move. And after I do, other people are going to make a move. And then we'll have a new game, different board, everything will be different. How do I like that compared to other moves I might make, right? And I'm not asking people to think 10 moves ahead, but the people who were doing this didn't even think 2 moves ahead. And that just seems crazy. And I've given older, smaller versions of this talk in places that cannot afford to put people on airplanes to come to this meeting or an IETF meeting or whatever. From their point of view, all of their choices are being driven by a bunch of rich, young Silicon Valley 20-somethings who don't have much experience with history or philosophy. And, they take what they get. They don't have a seat at the table. We should be thinking a little bit on their behalf. So this future is brutal, where code is law, where if you have the ability to change the way the distributed system works, then you are in that moment the president of the internet. And if anybody else doesn't like what you did, they have to write their own code and see if they can get it out there. Okay, this ends in tears. This ends in the Mad Max movies. I would like us to find a way to seek a little bit of consensus and stay away from some of the controversy. So I do not believe that we're in a post-national phase of human history. The Westphalia era is certainly partly over, because it did not think beyond land and sea, and so the definition of a nation has been obsoleted 3 times by airspace and information. But I still think that we need to give nations a role in our future, and that should not involve nations writing code, nor should it involve them forbidding us to write code. I think that there is a constructive future that we could pick that is not this one, and is not as brutal. Because you can only keep what you can defend has never ended well. That's just part of a tick and a talk, and the talk is even more brutal than the tick. And the fact that some corporations now have IT supremacy over most nations should concern us, because we don't know either as a voting public or as just a bunch of people on a ball of mud, how to live that way. And we're going to have to seek accommodation. And I don't think that this is the first step toward accommodation. Thank you very much for inviting me. This has been quite the honor. Should I take any questions? Microphones are open. Center mic. Try the one behind you. I can also repeat the question. This is Tony Tauber from Comcast, and he notes that the complexity and the cost make the idea of a home firewall unlikely, and that the fact that most new growth is in mobile devices that are not using home networks means that it would be irrelevant in any case. I think we could probably agree that this is going to be ugly, that a lot of money will be spent and probably more things will be broken than fixed. But I am expecting, even though it will be done badly, I am expecting it to be done. And certainly with my handheld, I have the ability to put it behind a firewall by making it speak IP and bringing a little LT to IPE converter that it has to talk to that I have the source code to. So I'm not sure exactly how crazy this is all going to get, but I will tell you that we are trending in that direction. Right now, your smart TV takes a census of 32 pixels of your television screen every second. And so it generates one long word per second of telemetry. And those 32 pixels uniquely identify what you were watching at that moment. So anybody who receives a copy of that 32 pixels per second feed is able to do exactly what they need to do in terms of optimizing their advertising and so on. These smart TV makers are generally not going to be profitable based only on the one-time cost of selling you the TV. If they don't have your PII, they will go out of business, and their assets will be bought after the bankruptcy by smart TV companies who did take your personal information. That's the world we're headed toward, and it's Darwinian in nature. We don't have a lot of choices about whether we're headed there, but we have our choices about whether some of us just say no.
Hello. Oh, it works. Hi, Patrick Gilmore, Adrex, speaking for myself. The thing that always worked for me back in the 90s and early 2000s was enlightened self-interest.
Louder.
I worried about, some of these things happen, but when I talked to other ISPs, they didn't want it to happen for their own reasons. But when I talk to people at certain companies, they seem to think it's okay to take all this information. Could we help solve this problem by, for instance, educating the rich 20-year-olds who don't seem to understand that doing this is bad for themselves as well as the rest of society?
So Patrick, you and I may not have been rich, but we were 20-year-olds together, and I don't think that we were examples of somebody that could have been told anything. So I'm sure that the same is true now as was true of us. which is that every generation thinks that they invented sex and a bunch of other stuff, and they're going to come to their own conclusions in their own way. The thing that is concerning is actually not what the young 20-somethings are doing. It's that nation-state networks and some ISP networks are not private. They are some form of public network, even if they're not regulated, but they want the rights that private networks would have to look at traffic and perturb some of that traffic. And as long as ISPs and national firewalls try to have the rights of managed private networks, we're going to see technology that makes it harder for managed private networks. I certainly know that China, for example, is not waiting to hear my opinion about how they ought to run their network. So I think there's no way to get these elephants off the field.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Bixby. I'm Scott Johnson from SolarNet One. Concerning the issue of a mobile device, which is essentially multi-homed in many instances in these days, would we not be able to resolve many of these problems if we moved the name resolution back to the client and run bind or a smaller version thereof on every client device?
So believe it or not, I've looked into that. The apps that are being put out there by companies like OpenDNS or Cloudflare in order to get your DNS from your smart device to go to their cloud instead of to your ISP are Trojans. They are masquerading as VPN applications, and Apple and Google for Android are permitting this type of thing as a type of VPN application. What that means is that the device, what that piece of software is doing is looking for DNS queries and grabbing them, and if it's not a DNS query, then it just gets sent not over the tunnel. And I'm expecting that loophole to be closed. I'm expecting handset makers, either because the networks force them to do it or because they themselves are also in the advertising business, are going to say, we don't want to allow that anymore. So as much as I would love to run Unbound or Bind or something on my smartphone, I mean, my smartphone has got more transistors in it than all of Deck.com had when I worked there in 1990. And so I know that it could run a name server. That's not a hard problem for something that powerful. But we are not in a permissionless innovation situation anymore. These choices will be managed for us by monopolists whose interests are not aligned with ours.
As a follow-up, what is your opinion on how we take that permission back for ourselves?
So
I'll fight if you will.
there's a lot of overlap between people who are sort of libertarian in nature and people who develop internet technology. So the idea of regulation is often laughed out of the room when you're talking to people who have come of age in what was a permissionless innovation situation. So I think the fix for this is going to have to come in the form of laws like GDPR. Right? Some of the abuses I've described to you today would already be illegal in Europe, and I don't expect Mozilla, for example, to turn on DOH anywhere in the GDPR land, because I've read GDPR and it says you can't do stuff like that without explicit case-by-case permission, which Mozilla is in no position to seek and is not seeking today. So I think we need to wait for the talk. Right now we're far to the populist, small to non-existent government style, and we need to get back to the point where responsible governance is not laughable, and that we're willing to try it. I know that Senator Wyden from Oregon is trying very hard to introduce some privacy legislation here that would begin to get parity with GDPR. But if the Tea Party continues to be the single party in control of all branches of government, we're not going to get far with that. So at the moment, the time is simply wrong to try and make this better. But what it's ultimately going to look like is GDPR.
Thank you, sir.
Rob Kronk from Ball State University. My question, first off, I want to preface, I really appreciated your philosophical points in the presentation. My question to you is, how far are we from DNS and these connections owned by these ISPs from being used as political tools? So I liked your point about the West Indian Trading Company. Arguably, at a certain point in history, they became larger than the English government. How far off are we from having these ISPs effectively become bigger than the governments that are meant to manage them?
Well, depending on how you measure, we're already there. But if you're asking sort of when will this be obvious to the man on the street, there's a great 1974 movie with James Caan called Rollerball that is worth looking up on Netflix or YouTube or whatever. I think Carol Cadwalladr did a short piece on how Brexit was tipped using Cambridge Analytica. A lot of people have done similar bits on how the Trump campaign was tipped using Cambridge Analytica. So the fact that a company who is effectively unregulated with regard to this type of behavior is already having such an outsized impact on world events is knowable by anyone who cares to know it. The data is available, the articles are available. Anybody who is not predisposed to think of that as fake news is capable of knowing that we're already well on our way to corporations having more power than nations. And waiting for those people to wake up, it seems hopeless, but it's the best I've got.
And a follow-up question. So hearkening back to how DNS is moving towards kind of a single point, for example, Google's 8.8.8.8, what would happen, say, if Google just absolutely refuses to, I don't know, let's say Ball State did something Google didn't appreciate with, and they just decided to completely remove our domain from their name server and just refuse to host any connections like that. What's stopping them from doing that? Is there anything that we can do to work around that, or just your thoughts on the matter?
Well, I think we all know, because we know how DDoS works, that any angry 13-year-old can bring down anything on the internet if they get angry. This whole thing is a house of cards. And the reason they don't is because there's no money to be made doing that. You need the internet to be up so that you can reach your victims, and that's why the internet stays up. It's not because the bad guys couldn't bring it down if they wanted to. And I think that's Google's position also. They've never filtered anything in 8.8. That's their superpower, according to them, is that 9.9 and OpenDNS both have long lists of things they won't return correct answers to because, hey, DNS is a good control point for cybersecurity, but 1.1 does not filter anything, and 8.8 does not filter anything, and I think that the first time they decided to filter anything, that would cause shockwaves through the set of people who only trust them because they don't act that way. But in terms of your recourse, rather than their deterrent, if they were to do that, you would have to seek remedy in civil court, probably something out of the Sherman Antitrust Act. But it would be very hard because you are small and they are large, and a couple of years of discovery will pretty much eat up whatever budget you thought you had for a lawsuit, but it won't stop somebody as large as Google.
Thank you.
Hi, Dmitry Kochmanyuk, personal capacity. Well, you're on DNS, we are top-level domain operator in Ukraine, and I mean, I remember these things 20, 30 years ago when it was Microsoft and closed source and responded with open source. well, I have this little Sony Xperia phone that can run Selfish OS. These are the same people that left Nokia, and started off their Linux-based operating system. And I think it's still possible. Maybe I should try to package Unbound as a thing that is similar to Quad One application, and it would do the same VPN thing, right? It's allowed, right? And you can send your queries, and then you can run your own instance in the cloud and send these queries to your own, bind or NSD in the cloud and so forth. So what's stopping anybody from doing that? I know it's not very profitable, but just like DuckDuckGo lives off without advertising, and I'm a user of them too, I don't see the hope. I'm waiting for episode 5, of course. What do you think?
I think that if something is going to be done, it will be because it either makes money or saves money for somebody. And I've been advising folks, you didn't need to move your recursive name server to the ISP. You could have kept that on your campus. You could put that in your house. There's a device out there called the Pi hole, which is based on a Raspberry Pi. It's a Linux image that acts as a DNS server. But I got to say, you should imagine your parents receiving one of these, and they got to find a way to get it plugged into the Wi-Fi network. They've got to get into the DSL gateway or whatever that is, cable modem box, and set up a route to make sure that that box has a known address. And they've got to set up the DHCP server to assign that address. I think you can imagine that your parents are not going to do that, and that you don't want to go do it for them, because then every time it breaks, they're going to call you. So the reason that we're moving things further and further from where the questions enter is because there's money to be made doing that. And until there's money to be made or saved by bringing it back to something close to you, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, just like it's profitable to sell people sugary drinks and then treat them for obesity, it's profitable to sell people things that violate their privacy and then sell them privacy protection tools, right? Okay, but that's a big discussion. Thank you.
If there are no more questions, I will surrender the stage. Thank you again for inviting me.